How would you feel if the woman you lived with for 22 years secretly slept with your best friend on the very bed you bought? Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, doesn't it? But it happened to me, a man who spent his entire youth building a family, pouring everything into a life he thought was real. I'm Malcolm Mac Reed, 52 years old and owner of Steelheart Dynamics, a heavy equipment contracting company I built from nothing but calloused hands, grit, and 18-hour days in Atlanta, Georgia. 22 years of marriage to Vanessa. 15 years of brotherhood with Julian Jules Banks. 22 years of thinking I knew what loyalty truly meant. I stood in our kitchen that night, still in my work boots, the day's exhaustion riding my shoulders like a familiar, unwelcome weight. The kitchen clock showed 9:30 p.m. Late, but not unusual. Not for a man trying to land the Henderson Tower project, a deal that would double our business and secure our legacy. "Big project," I said, scrubbing diesel grease from under my fingernails. "You know how it is." Vanessa nodded, her lips pressed thin. She'd been different lately, distracted. Her phone always face down on the polished granite counter, always within reach. She used to light up when I talked about my day, used to listen to the little victories and setbacks. Now, there was just the quiet scrape of her fork on her reheated dinner plate, meant for one. She'd also started wearing new, expensive jewelry I hadn't bought her, little pieces she'd casually dismiss as gifts from Keisha. "Jules called," she said, too casual, not meeting my eyes. "Wanted to know if we're still on for the barbecue this weekend?" I dried my hands slowly. Julian Jules Banks, my best friend since our college days at Morehouse, the godfather to our son Jordan, the man who stood by me when my father passed, when the bank nearly foreclosed on our first equipment yard, when Vanessa miscarried our second child. He'd even helped Vanessa fix that leaky faucet in the guest bathroom last month, a chore I usually handled. "Yeah, tell him I'll bring the ribs," I said, trying to keep the lightness in my voice. She managed a quick smile, a fleeting thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. Then her phone buzzed. She flipped it over, read something, and that fragile smile softened, became real, private, almost secretive. "Just Keisha from book club," she offered, though I hadn't even asked. I just nodded, the knot in my gut tightening, and headed for the shower. That knot. It was the same one I'd felt when the Grayson Group tried to undercut our bid by importing cheaper equipment from Mexico. The same knot when the bank manager, a young hotshot who clearly underestimated me, called me boy while explaining why our loan for expansion wasn't approved. It was that cold, clear feeling that screamed, "Something's wrong here. Pay attention." Under the hot water, I thought about Jules's new Escalade. How did he afford that on a 15% stake? About Vanessa's sudden passion for book club meetings every Thursday night, often running late, sometimes ending with her smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize. About how they both seemed to find reasons to check their phones at the exact same moment during our last family dinner. I'd ignored the signs for weeks, maybe even months, but ignoring rot doesn't stop it from spreading. I met Julian Banks back in 2010 on a construction site. He was a site manager. I was subcontracting the heavy equipment work. We bonded over our shared love for classic R&B and the grind of the industry. We were two young men, hungry and ambitious, pushing each other to aim higher. When I decided to start Steelheart Dynamics 3 years later, Jules was the first person I called. He invested $30,000, most of his savings, for his 15% stake, and never once questioned my decisions, even when we barely broke even those first few years. Vanessa and I had already been married for 7 years by then. She'd stood by me when I was just an operator making hourly wages, when we lived in that one-bedroom apartment with the leaky ceiling. She'd believed in the dream, even when her parents, who'd seen plenty of broken dreams, called me a guy with dirt under his nails and nothing to show for it. We built something real together, a home, a son, Jordan, now in college studying engineering, a life where her parents eventually ate their words at our 20th anniversary party, her father admitting I'd done all right after all, while eyeing the lake house we'd just bought. The first real crack appeared last Christmas. Jules's wife, Tanisha, had left him the year before, claiming she needed space. He spent the holiday with us, like family should. I noticed how Vanessa touched his arm when she laughed at his jokes, how their eyes held a beat too long when they thought I wasn't watching. I brushed it off, told myself it was nothing. Jules had been my brother for 15 years. You don't throw that away over a hunch. Then came the missed calls on her phone from Keisha at odd hours, the new perfume she started wearing to book club, the way she'd jump when I walked into a room while she was texting. Jules started finding reasons to stop by the house when I was still at job sites, offering to help Vanessa with household tasks I usually handled, or dropping off documents he could have easily emailed. I kept my mouth shut, kept working late to secure our future, to expand the business we'd built. Every man has blind spots when it comes to the people he trusts most. Mine were staring me in the face, and still I looked away, until I couldn't anymore. It was a Tuesday evening in April when everything fell apart. I'd finished at the Henderson Tower site early. We'd finally landed the contract, a huge win, and I decided to surprise Vanessa by coming home for dinner instead of grabbing takeout. I stopped to pick up a bottle of her favorite Merlot, feeling like we needed to reconnect, like maybe I could fix whatever was pulling us apart. The house was quiet when I walked in, too quiet for 7 in the evening. Vanessa's car was in the driveway, but she wasn't in the kitchen or living room. I set the wine on the counter, noticing her phone next to the sink, screen lit up with an incoming message. I'd never been the type to check my wife's phone, never needed to, but something about the timing, the eerie silence in the house, the knot in my gut that had grown too large to ignore. My hand moved before I could second-guess myself. The message was from Jules. Left my jacket upstairs. Don't tell Mac I stopped by. My body went cold, not with shock, but with a chilling certainty, like the final tumbler in a lock clicking into place. I took the stairs slowly, each step measured, listening. The master bedroom door was partly open. I pushed it wider and found Vanessa sitting on the edge of our bed, holding Jules's leather jacket, the one I'd given him for his 50th birthday. She looked up, saw me standing there, and the color drained from her face. "Malcolm," she whispered, just my name, hanging in the heavy air between us. I held up her phone, screen still lit. He left his jacket. She didn't deny it, didn't try to spin some flimsy story about helping him with paperwork or discussing a surprise party for me. She just sat there, shoulders slumped, still clutching his jacket. "You're always working late," she finally said, eyes fixed on the floor, her voice barely a whisper. He was there for me. I nodded slowly, feeling strangely calm, a stillness settling over me. I get it. I just need some time to process this. I turned and walked out, down the stairs, grabbing my keys from the hook by the door. I drove to the empty Steelheart Dynamics office and sat at my desk in the dark, staring at nothing. It wasn't just the betrayal of my wife. It was Jules. 15 years of brotherhood, 15 years of trust. the man who'd helped me build everything I had, now trying to take the most important part. I pulled out my desk bottle, the good single malt we broke open when we landed the Henderson Tower project just that morning, and poured 2 fingers. Didn't drink it, just stared at the amber liquid catching light from the parking lot outside. By midnight, I hadn't touched the whiskey, but something had hardened inside me. The pain was still there, a physical ache behind my ribs, but it was being walled off by something colder, more focused. I'd spent my life building things, equipment fleets, a company, a marriage. Now I was going to take something apart, piece by careful piece. I pulled out my phone and called Attorney Desmond Price's private number. I gave Vanessa space for exactly 3 days. Slept in the guest room. Didn't ask where she went during the day or who she was talking to when her phone rang. I was cordial, distant, processing exactly what a stunned husband should be doing. What she didn't see was what happened during business hours. The morning after finding Jules's jacket, I met with Desmond Price, the sharp corporate attorney who'd helped structure Steelheart Dynamics when we first incorporated. We sat in his downtown office, blinds half drawn against the bright spring sunshine. "You want to trigger Article 7?" Desmond said, eyebrows raised. "Not a question," I replied. "Yes, Article 7 was my insurance policy. When Jules and I formalized his investment 15 years ago, Desmond had suggested including a clause that would protect the company if either partner engaged in actions that could damage its reputation. At the time, I was thinking about gambling debts or DUIs, things that could scare off clients in our conservative industry. I never imagined I'd use it because my partner was sleeping with my wife. "It'll mean buying him out at predetermined rates," Desmond warned, 20 cents on the dollar of current valuation. I nodded. "I know, and you have proof." I slid my phone across the desk, the text messages I'd downloaded from Vanessa's phone while she slept, the GPS history showing Jules's truck parked at our house during work hours when I was at job sites, the emails I'd found when I finally checked her laptop, some even discussing his investment in her happiness. Desmond scrolled through it all, his expression professionally neutral. "This will get ugly, Mac. It's already ugly." Over the following week, after several intense meetings with Desmond, the papers were ready. I called Jules and asked him to meet me at the office after hours. Said I needed to discuss the Henderson Tower project expansion. He showed up looking exactly like he always did. Crisp work shirt, designer jeans, that leather birthday jacket, like a man with nothing to hide, like my brother. "Hey, fam," he said, dropping into the chair across from my desk. "What's so urgent it couldn't wait till morning?" I slid the folder across to him. "Article 7, Dissolution Papers. I'm buying your shares." His face went from confused to shocked to angry in the space of seconds as he flipped through the documents. "What the hell is this? Article 7? Actions detrimental to the company's reputation. Where is this coming from?" I kept my voice level. "You know exactly where it's coming from, Jules." "Is this about Vanessa?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice like we were conspirators. "Look, I know things haven't been great between you two. She's been lonely, man. It just happened. 15 years of brotherhood, and that's your explanation. It just happened." He ran a hand through his carefully groomed hair. "You've been absent, Mac, working all the time, building this precious company. When was the last time you actually listened to her, actually showed up?" His voice took on a righteous edge. "You drove her right to me." I almost laughed. "So it's my fault?" "I'm not signing this," he said, pushing the folder back. You can't force me out over a personal matter. Actually, I can. Section 3, paragraph 2. Read it. He glanced down, reading the fine print he'd signed 15 years ago without a second thought. His face darkened. You do this to me after everything we've built together. You did this to us, I corrected. I'm just following the contract. Jules stood up, knocking his chair back. Vanessa won't stand for this. She'll back me up. I just nodded. You should call her. He pulled out his phone, his fingers jabbing at the screen as he stormed out. I sat back in my chair, waiting for the next domino to fall. The next morning, Jules showed up at my house. I was in the kitchen making coffee when he burst through the front door like he owned the place. Maybe in his mind, he thought he did. What did you say to her? He demanded, face flushed with anger. I took my time pouring the coffee. Who? Vanessa? She's not answering my calls. Her sister said she left town yesterday. That was news to me. I'd given her space, hadn't tracked her movements, but I kept my face neutral as I sipped my coffee. Maybe she needed time to think. Jules slammed his palm on the counter. Don't play games. You threatened her, didn't you? Made her choose between me and your money. I set my mug down carefully. I didn't have to threaten anyone, Jules. I showed her the same paperwork I showed you, the dissolution of our partnership, and I showed her the prenuptial agreement she signed when we got married, the one with the infidelity clause. His face went slack. What infidelity clause? The one that says, if either party commits adultery, they forfeit all rights to community property acquired during the marriage, including ownership stake in Steelheart Dynamics. This was the piece Jules never knew about. When Vanessa and I married, my wise grandmother, a woman who'd seen it all, had insisted I add this clause to protect my future, my legacy. A man building something from nothing needs every layer of protection, Malcolm, she told me. I'd agreed, and we'd both signed it, then filed it away, never expecting to need it. You're lying, Jules said, but his voice lacked conviction. I walked to my home office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder. Inside was the original prenup with both our signatures, along with the amendment clarifying the infidelity clause. Jules read it, then looked up at me with something like awe. You've been planning this for 22 years? No, I said honestly. I've been protecting what's mine for 22 years. There's a difference. He sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. So that's it? You strip us both of everything? Not everything, I corrected. Just what you took from me. But there was more Jules didn't know. While he'd been busy destroying our brotherhood and my marriage, I'd been reviewing all of Steelheart Dynamics' client contracts. Most had been signed with my personal guarantee, not the company's. The clients were loyal to me, to Malcolm Reed, not just to our logo. I'd also discovered something that turned my stomach. Going back through the company books, I found small discrepancies. Equipment rentals billed to projects that never used them, expense accounts that didn't match receipts, vendor payments that seemed inflated, all managed by Jules. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out another folder. The audit of your expense accounts for the past 3 years. Jules's eyes widened. Malcolm, that's not what? Not embezzlement? Because the accountant says it looks exactly like embezzlement. $173,000 worth. The blood drained from his face. It was temporary. I was going to put it back. With what money? Your divorce from Tanisha cleaned you out 2 years ago. I needed it for Tanisha's settlement, he admitted, then for the down payment on the new house, then to impress. He trailed off. To impress my wife, I finished for him. He stared at the floor. What are you going to do? I closed the folder. That depends on whether you sign the dissolution papers. Sign, and this audit never sees the light of day, and I won't pursue criminal charges. Fight me, and I'll take this to the district attorney. Jules looked at me for a long moment. You've thought of everything, haven't you? No, I said quietly. I never thought I'd have to think of this. I gave Jules 24 hours to sign the papers. He did it in 12. By the end of the week, his 15% stake in Steelheart Dynamics belonged to me at 20 cents on the dollar, a fraction of what it was worth after we'd landed the Henderson Tower project. What he didn't know was that I'd already been in touch with Mr. Henderson himself at Henderson Tower Construction. I'd personally guaranteed our performance on their project, assuring them that the internal restructuring at Steelheart wouldn't affect their timeline or quality. Mr. Henderson, a respected figure in the Atlanta construction scene, had clapped me on the shoulder and said, "We always knew we were hiring you, Malcolm, not just your company." While Jules was cleaning out his office, I was meeting with our 3 other major clients, securing their business with personal handshakes and revised contracts. By the time he'd finished packing his photos and coffee mug, I'd locked down 80% of our annual revenue with ironclad agreements that followed me, not the Steelheart name. Vanessa returned after a week at her sister's place in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was in the backyard splitting firewood when her car pulled into the driveway. She approached cautiously, like she was testing thin ice. "We need to talk," she said. I set down the axe. About us. About what happens next. Her voice was steady, practiced. She'd been rehearsing this conversation. "I've already filed the divorce papers," I said. "Your copy is on the kitchen counter." She blinked, thrown off her script. "Just like that? 22 years of marriage and you're throwing it away without even trying to fix things?" The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. "You already made that decision," I said, picking up another log. "I'm just handling the paperwork." "Malcolm, people make mistakes. Marriages recover from affairs all the time." I lined up the axe. "This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You made it every day for months." I brought the axe down, splitting the log clean through. The crack echoed across the yard. "What about the house?" she asked, shifting to practical matters now that the emotional appeal had failed. "And your retirement accounts? My lawyer says I'm entitled to half of everything." I set the axe down again and faced her directly. "Your lawyer should read your prenup more carefully, specifically the infidelity clause." Her face went pale. "That old thing? We signed that 22 years ago. It can't possibly." "It can and it does," I said, cutting her off. "But I'm not leaving you with nothing. You'll get the vacation cabin and a settlement, enough to start over." "Not enough to share with Jules." Her eyes widened. "Jules? What does he have to do with the divorce?" "Nothing anymore. He's been bought out of Steelheart Dynamics. The money he embezzled is being repaid through the sale of his shares." She sat down heavily on the garden bench. "Embezzled? What are you talking about?" "He told me it was all his, that you'd given him that cut as a bonus." Vanessa shook her head, stunned. I realized then that she didn't know Jules had been stealing to maintain the lifestyle that impressed her, to afford the gifts and dinners and weekend getaways. He'd betrayed not just me, but her expectations too. The man she thought she knew was a lie. "Ask him yourself," I said, picking up the axe again, "though I doubt he'll take your call now that he's lost his golden goose." She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. The man who would have forgiven her anything, who would have worked himself to death to give her everything. That man died the night I found Jules' jacket on our bed. "Who are you?" she whispered. I split another log. Someone who's done carrying people who are planning to drop me. 6 weeks after finding Jules's jacket, I sat in a conference room at Legacy Builders Group, the second largest construction company in the Southeast. Across from me were their CEO, Mr. Sterling Reed, and their lead counsel. Between us lay a stack of papers, the acquisition agreement for Steelheart Dynamics. "One last chance to reconsider, Malcolm," Sterling said. "Once you sign, there's no turning back." I reached for the pen. I'm not the one who will be having regrets. The plan had come together almost by accident. 2 weeks after forcing Jules out, I'd gotten a call from Sterling. Legacy Builders had been trying to expand their heavy equipment division for years. With the Henderson Tower project secured and my company's reputation stronger than ever, the timing was perfect. I could have said no, could have kept building Steelheart Dynamics myself, but the company had become tainted, a daily reminder of betrayal. I needed a clean break, a fresh start. So I'd made a deal. Legacy Builders would acquire Steelheart Dynamics for twice its market value, with the condition that I stay on as division president for 2 years, bringing my client relationships and expertise with me. After that, I'd be free to retire or start something new. I signed my name on the final page, sliding the contract back across the table. Sterling's secretary appeared at the door. "Mr. Sterling Reed, there's someone here to see Mr. Reed, a Mr. Banks." Sterling looked at me. I nodded. Jules walked in, his face tight, with barely controlled anger. "You sold the company without even offering me the chance to buy back in?" I stood, extending my hand to Sterling. "Thank you for your time. I look forward to our partnership." As the Legacy Builders executives filed out, I finally turned to Jules. "You're right. I sold it for $17 million. His mouth fell open. 17, but my shares were worth about $600,000 at the time you sold them back to me for $120,000. The magnitude of what he'd lost, not just in money but in reputation and status within our community, hit him all at once. "You son of a—" "I'd be careful with the next words out of your mouth," I said quietly. "You're standing on very thin ice as it is." Jules' fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't over?" "Actually," I said, collecting my copy of the contract, "it is." 1 year later, I stood on the deck of my new cabin overlooking Lake Lanier, Georgia. Not the vacation place Vanessa got in the divorce, a new one, bigger, with a workshop out back where I was restoring a 1967 Harley I'd wanted since I was 19. The divorce had been final for 9 months. The settlement was exactly what I'd offered her from the start. Fair, but not generous. She'd taken it without a fight once her lawyer confirmed the prenup would hold up in court. I'd heard through mutual friends that she and Jules had tried to make a go of it for a few months before it fell apart. He couldn't keep up the lifestyle she expected, not after losing his stake in Steelheart Dynamics and having his reputation tarnished in our industry. Last I heard, she'd moved to Seattle, trying to start fresh. Jules had it worse. After our confrontation at Legacy Builders, he'd tried to launch his own equipment rental business, calling on the same clients we'd built relationships with over the years. But word had gotten around about his exit from Steelheart, about the accounting irregularities during his tenure. No one would touch him. He'd ended up taking a salaried position with a small outfit in Birmingham, Alabama, a major step down for a man who once owned part of the biggest equipment contractor in Atlanta. His standing in the community, once solid, was now shattered. I took a sip of my coffee, watching an osprey circle over the lake. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Jordan, my son. He was coming home for the weekend, wanted to know if I was free for dinner. I texted back, "Always free for you." At 53, I wasn't where I thought I'd be at this stage of my life. My marriage was over, my best friend was a stranger, the company I'd built was in someone else's hands, even if I still ran it day to day. But I was standing on my own deck, breathing clean air, with my son still in my life and $17 million in investments working for me. I'd lost what wasn't real and kept what mattered. Some men spend their whole lives learning who they can trust. I learned it in one brutal night. Expensive lesson, but worth every penny. Hey viewers, welcome to the channel. We're just getting started, and your support means a lot. If you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Thanks for being here.